I don't know when it was that I began to appreciate days like this. But when you get old, you appreciate every day. I get that, but it is a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day for any part of the year, but especially for this time of the year. And we aren't that far removed from some kind of nasty days, and makes you appreciate it even more. It's also the Lord's Day, and it's a day for us to come together and particularly focus on Him and on His great gift that makes it possible for us to be with Him forever, and that's a good thing. It's a great day to be associated with people that are striving to do what is right, and it's a good feeling. Welcome to the Central Church of Christ Bible study. We're in the middle of a series of lessons on church leadership. It's not the easiest thing in the world to teach, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to study. It's meat, and meat is always more difficult. You have to be focused, you have to try. It's real easy just to get worn out by it in both directions, and I get that. So just be patient with yourself. Continue to be patient with me, and we'll see what we can learn. Let's look back at what we've learned just for a minute. When you think about leadership and the role of leaders in God's kingdom, we're being reminded over and over again at the start, rather than jumping into the qualifications, as I've mentioned so many times, I want to dispel that notion in your mind forever, so I keep beating on it, that there is a lot more in the Bible to learn about leadership than from just Timothy and Titus. Those passages are really important, but they are just part of the package. Maybe that's not the right phrase, but I'll just use it and you translate, as I sometimes say. We pride ourselves, hopefully in a good way, on being consistently trying to see what the entire scriptures say about anything. We don't just take a single passage or a couple of passages, but we look at what the scriptures as a whole teach us, and then we take that package and apply it to whatever the subject is. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so we've been focusing especially on trying to dispel some of the notions that commonly are held about what leaders ought to be, how they're to operate, the circumstances under which they function. Contrast that with the world's style of leadership and say, now God's leaders are to be like this. They're not to be like this. They're to be like this. And also to dispel the notion that, okay, God's leaders are infallible and we must accept everything they say and do everything they tell us to do. That's true only so far as they are following the scriptures. And because of circumstances where that's not always the case, we need to be on our guard to make sure that we are following the scriptures first, and that we follow no man except for that man be one who is following the scriptures themselves. We were looking at 8 principles that characterize good New Testament leaders, and we talked about how such leaders understand their mission. We do have a mission individually and collectively. This probably comes naturally to some of you. I don't know where it came from. I don't try to overanalyze stuff like that. But my nature is to be more or less, although it doesn't always show, either in my speech or on my desk, but I try to be relatively organized, and I'm goal-oriented. And so that notion of having a mission and a focus isn't so alien to me. But if you're kind of a freewheeling person, where you just kind of go here and there, and you pride yourself on your multitasking, which I would defy you to be able to demonstrate if it's very complicated. I don't think we can do that with the scriptures too well. Then maybe, that's a little tougher. But New Testament leaders did understand what they were to be about. Jesus tried to keep that focus in mind with his apostles. And the apostles themselves were constantly reminding themselves and their audience of what the mission was. Good New Testament leaders led by self-examination. We need to constantly be checking our progress. We don't need to just be floating along. We need to monitor where we are. And there are good periods of time for that, but I'm suggesting to you just about any time really is. It should be a continuing process. We tend to do that sort of thing at milestones in the year, maybe a birthday, maybe the end of a quarter. Certainly at the beginning of a new year, there's the tendency to say, well, I'm going to do in this coming year better, and that's a good sort of thing. But I'll tell you something that's really kind of embarrassing for me is when I think back over all the decades I've had to grow, how big a difference have I really made in those decades? How much progress have I made? That's a good question for you to ask yourself too. Okay, it's easy to get caught up in the minutia of all right, I'm always there on Sundays. I'm always there on Sunday nights. Hey, I show up on Wednesdays even. I do good things. Okay, that's nice. And I don't mean that sarcastically or flippantly. That's nice. That's a good thing. But how much have you grown spiritually? How much have you grown in the knowledge of the Word? And that's tough enough. I can assure you that the life of a scholar, of a student, is not an easy one at all. That's why so few pursue it. But that's the easiest part of the whole deal. The hard part is actually doing what you know. I know a whole lot better than I do. I imagine that's pretty much true for most of us. So how are we growing? Self-examination. The New Testament leaders led by loving the church. I remind you a little insert here. We talked about the 3 knots of Peter. They didn't lead by this and this and this and this. These are all positive qualities that every leader within the kingdom, male or female, whether an official office or a realm of responsibility or whatever, needs to keep in mind. When you know somebody loves you, you're going to listen to them. You may not always agree with them, but you're going to pay attention to them because you know they care. And they've demonstrated that care. I'm really tempted to mention a name right now, but this is one of those times I'm going to forego that. But I'll bet in your mind you can easily have names and faces that pop into view where you're thinking, okay, this is someone who really has shown their love and care for me. And that is something that causes all of us to want to pay attention to that person and to follow that person's lead where they're doing right. It seems to me that of all of these characteristics, this next one that we looked at the end of last class is the key to Christian leadership. They led by a spiritual example. Leaders in the kingdom are not bosses. Contrary to the way it's expressed in some places, although it's not a popular way of doing it, they do not rule as we consider the word rule. And that makes for a very difficult job in itself. It's one thing to be a foreman or a CEO or chairman of the board, and you give directives, and if you don't like it, you're fired. It's something else to have to persuade, to have to lead people without giving them orders, without being their boss. Elders are not bosses. In fact, we've been told over and over again, and we'll look at that concept a little further down the road again and again. But Jesus tried hard. That's why I keep this up here, is to remind us of a core fundamental principle. Jesus reminds us that the world's notion of greatness and leadership is very different from what we're accustomed to. We're just not into that mindset as a society, and very few are. But the idea of spiritual example is a very powerful one. And I can't help but notice the other side of that coin. It can be a powerful one for good or for bad. And we know which one the world is always looking at. It is easy even from the inside, and I've been guilty of this several times, but I'm better after I made up a little saying to help me. You know, if I go out there and I buy a used car from somebody that's not a Christian, and I drive it off the lot and the tires fall off and the engine starts smoking and all of that, that's irritating. That's really annoying. That's very upsetting. But if I am misled or there's a dishonest deal with a Christian, it's a whole different level. It's a whole different standard. And so we can easily get disappointed with ourselves and each other. I'm disappointed in me a lot. You know, if you're disappointed in me, you're going to have to stand in line because I'm at the head of the line. And I think most of us get that. You know, most of us are about as hard on ourselves as anybody else is going to be. That comes with that self-examination. And as long as we don't wallow in it, it's a good thing because it spurs us on to try to improve and to be better. But we need to be really careful about that example, because the first thing an outsider or insider is going to do is they're going to point to the weak link. The common phrase about, well, all those Christians are a bunch of hypocrites, hardly ever is, when you use the word all, is it actually true. That's hyperbole. But all it takes is one to be right there under your nose, and that's all they can see. Sometimes that's all I could see. So here's Ron's little saying. You've heard it before in a lot of cases. You've been around here. I keep running the same stuff at you over and over and over because I want you to remember it, because I think it will help you as you go along. The system is perfect, but the people aren't. God's system is perfect, but not me. So the people are going to let you down. You're going to let yourself down, just as we alluded to earlier. But God's leaders lead by spiritual example. They're struggling to do right. They want to do right. Their intention is right. And that's the key. They lead by humble service. Don't you notice what's missing in all of this? It's part of those cultural views of leadership. They're almost all out of the picture. A lot of Christianity is like a paradox. It doesn't seem like it ought to be that way, but that's the way that it is. And that's the way that works. Let's look at an example of somebody that I bet you don't think of very often. Turn to 1 Corinthians with me, if you will. In chapter 16, we see an example of one of those, I would say, I may be wrong. You may be, this may be somebody that stuck with you and you roll them out in your memory every once in a while as a familiar character that's a great example. But I don't think of this person very much at all, but they are a perfect example for where we are now. Look at verse 15 and following. Now I urge you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanus were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the, I can't hardly see that word, service, right? Service. They devoted themselves to the service of the saints. And now here's the kicker in the continuation of that. Verse 16. Be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer. That's a formula there. A sort of a hidden formula for success for God's people. Here is a man and his family who are showing leadership. And the way they are doing that is because they've devoted themselves to service. I don't think of Stephanus very often, but maybe I ought to make a big poster with his name here and hang on the other side or something to remind us, and I need a mirror so I can see it, that this is a good example of how it ought to be. Humble service is not the boss. It's not the ruler. We see that over and over and over again in the scriptures. We're not saying there isn't authority. There is authority with eldership. There is authority. But it is not the authority of a ruler or a boss. It just isn't there. And that's, by the way, in English and in Greek. We'll look more at that, actually, as time goes on again. Principle number 6. They led by church designation. Elders just don't appear out of the blue and take charge. Now, there are times in the world when a leader just emerges, okay, because of their qualities, because of their character, good or bad. They appear out of nowhere. How can an unsuccessful painter become the leader of a very powerful nation and basically have them all doing his bidding when at their heart they all had to realize that something didn't smell right? Some of you that like history and some of you that are old enough know that's a description of Adolf Hitler. But within the church, we don't have these power plays like this going and them work very well. There is a sort of a hint of that in some people's leadership, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. It was the church who told the apostles that there was a need for taking care of these widows and the food situation. And so the apostles said, all right, we're going to tell you this one and this. No, that's not the way that worked. The church picked out men, and basically the apostles confirmed those men. That's a good example of leadership, by the way. We'll hit on that principle over and over again as we get further. But good leaders don't try to take on the whole load. It'll break your back. You can't do everything. But in this instance, the church was involved. So church leaders make sure the church is involved. The church is not left out of major decisions. Look with me at Acts 15. Actually, the whole chapter needs to be read, sort of, but I'm going to cherry pick just a particular verse. Look at verse 22. Then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church. With the whole church. This was not just a small group dealing with this. Anytime there is a major, perhaps sometimes minor, but certainly if there is a major situation going on, good leaders, just out of plain old common sense and good judgment, will involve the whole church. Well, like what, Ron? Okay, give me a practical example. Okay. I don't think it would really be a swift idea for our leaders to come up and announce to us one day, we have sold this property and we have spent $10 million of your funds to buy a lot out on the West End, because the West End's where it's all at, man, you know. So we're going to buy a lot out there, and that'll take care of the lot. But I know it's an expensive lot, but it's only going to get higher, so we're going to do this now. And now we're going to start on building out there, and the building is going to cost a few $1 million, so let's all give till it hurts. You think that would go over very well? That's just not common sense. There are people that are into that power play of leadership. Well, let's don't tell them any more than they need to know. That's not going to work very well. You know, the weird thing is, I saw about a half a dozen heads nodding out there, so you've been in these situations. Some of us, we've never been there, and we're thinking, Ron, where on earth are you coming from? I'm just coming from the real world, this planet. One of the things I noticed about, I don't know much about very many things at all. I know 3 areas really, really well, relatively speaking. I know something about schools. If you spend 30 plus years of your life in a school and you haven't learned a little bit about what schools are like, then you're just kind of pretty dumb. And I may be dumb, but I'm not pretty dumb. So I can talk to you about schools. I know something about Lewis and Clark, and I know something about the Oregon Trail. So those are my 3 areas, you know. Anything else, I just kind of look. Or I may nod my head knowingly, which means I have no knowingly. The one thing I learned about schools is they love to multiply staff, but not where the staff counts, not in the front lines, not out there where there need to be more teachers and more custodians and more cafeteria workers and more bus drivers. We need another assistant superintendent. And so the central office grows and grows and grows, and the budget gets higher and higher and higher. And one of those guys' salary would pay for 3 teachers, 6 or 7 bus drivers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? Churches are not so far off on that sometimes. Let's increase our staff. What I really think we need here at Central is a minister of music, a minister of microphones, a minister of podiums. We have a work to do, and let's get us another staff member. That's because us guys that are a part of the congregation, we don't have time to do that, so we're going to hire a pro. I mean, that's the core of it. We're not going to say it like that, but that's the core of it. Let's hire somebody to do our job. Now, I'm not saying that you and I can do the job that Adam and Noah do when it comes to being up here. Clearly, that ought to be obvious with me being here. But I'll say this. No disrespect. We'd survive without you. It might not be as good, but we've got a dozen guys here who can stand up here and teach the truth. And we should have 100 guys who, if they can't teach it, can read it. So when we're dealing with big decisions like this, the congregation needs to be involved. This doesn't need to be some show for personal acclamation. And that's another common denominator between schools and sometimes churches. The superintendent can say, well, during my tenure so far, I have increased this and I have increased that. And preachers and elders can say, well, our numbers have leaped 40% since I've been there. Hey, if they have, and that's 40 souls, 40% more souls, that's a good thing, you know. I'm not so sure bragging about it is so good. It does seem to me like we've talked about that one too. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Pride is mentioned a few times in the book of Proverbs, as I recall. Humble service. Humble service. Whatever is going on within the church, churches do not need to be left out of the decisions. A side note on this. We do not select men because they are good guys and hard workers. Because they are godly men. There is more to it than that. I've heard folks say they'll grow into it. Elders are not a job you grow into, folks. You're there already. In fact, most of the time, people who are elders are already doing many of the works of an elder. They just don't have the title yet. No, we do not pick somebody who is not qualified. There's the bottom line. And say, but they're at the church building every time it's open. You know, they're out there doing good works. You know, you can always count on them for the dirty work that nobody else wants to do. Those are all admirable qualities. But you can't find them on any list of qualifications. And if they are short of knowledge of the scriptures, or willingness to teach, or any number of other things, they will be a very valued member of the congregation, but not as a church leader because they aren't qualified. Principle 7, similar. Their leadership was one of church agreement. Look at 1 Corinthians 5. This is not a pleasant subject. The church at Corinth had this very flagrant situation going of immorality. And worse than that, they were bragging about it, about how broad-minded they were and being able to handle this. after Paul goes through all of this, look at verse 11 and following, indicating the role of the whole church in dealing with this. This was not just an eldership dealing with it, but it involved the entire congregation. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. You think that last sentence is directed just specifically at the elders alone? This was a congregation-wide situation that needed to be dealt with. I can't let this one pass. There are folks in this very room, so I'm stepping on toes. I told you I was blunt at the very beginning. Your favorite verse in the Bible may be, and you may not even know where it is, or you might. Judge not that you be not judged. I'm about to pop that balloon, so if you want to run, now's the time. I give you fair warning. That verse is definitely in the scriptures. First of all, I would say you need to read the rest of the chapter. Remember, we pride ourselves on using the whole scriptures, not just picking little bits and pieces out of context. Adam's really big on context. I'm not. I think it's really important. I just oftentimes am willing to take a verse in isolation because it makes a point. I'm not sure whether that's good use of the scriptures or not. But I think a spiritual lesson can be made from a single event, and we would agree on that. And I would definitely agree that context is really important. But we can't just pick that first verse out of, out of context and say, okay, see there, Matthew 7 tells us not to judge. Look at what this verse says here. It must mean that there are times when you do and times when you don't. Verse 12. If you're really big on judge not, I hope you'll write this one down and stick it on your refrigerator. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? Surely to goodness, we all have one common denominator here. We all agree that God is the ultimate judge. Surely we can agree on that. But it goes more close to home than just that. There are times when it's necessary for the entire church to make a decision about something that's not right. It's not a time for leaving the elders dangling out there to do the dirty work themselves. It's just not right. Don't get mad at me. It's in the book. But if you got to get mad at me, go ahead. I'd rather you get mad at me than the Holy Spirit. I don't have any power. So that's kind of a side lesson about leadership. Leadership is to be backed in the difficult decisions. And let's not get all carried away with judge not, seeing as how there's a little more to that picture. In dealing with leadership patterns, there is a terrible danger that sometimes congregations can get into, and that is some elderships work to perpetuate themselves. That's wrong. It's time for new leaders. Our leaders at present are working well together. It's like they pretty much know how everybody stands on things, and everything is meshing good. As we would say in the secular world, there's good chemistry there. We don't want to mess the chemistry up. Well, that's sound. But let's agree among ourselves who we're going to pick and who we're going to reject, because I'm not comfortable working with them. I would suggest to you that the question isn't, are you comfortable working with them or not? The question is, are these people qualified? As I wandered through the ivy-covered walls, I picked up a major or two, and one of them was political science. And one of the things that stuck with me in that class was how presidents pick their advisors. A brief reminder from your 9th grade civics class. There is a panel of people called the cabinet, and each one of those members is over a certain field or area. They're designated to be in charge of that area. But in addition to those, all presidents have had other advisors. They may not even be known to the general public. One that comes to mind, this is only for history buffs, Harry Hopkins. I see all the nods and, oh yeah, I know Harry Hopkins, yeah. Well, I will guarantee you that Franklin Roosevelt knew Harry Hopkins very well, because Harry Hopkins was his go-to when he wanted to bounce an idea off of somebody, and he knew that he would get a knowledgeable and honest response back. And so the point was, leaders can do one of two things in this particular round. They can pick a bunch of yes men to surround them with somebody that will always say, oh, what you're doing is just wonderful, Mr. President. It's all great. It's all good. And since presidents hardly ever wander out there among the common people, their job just doesn't hardly allow for that for a whole bunch of reasons. They can easily be isolated from the truth. So Harry Hopkins is one of those straight shooters, and Roosevelt kept him around because when everybody else was saying, oh, that's a wonderful idea, that's a wonderful idea, Harry Hopkins was the kind of guy that would say, what on earth are you thinking? So leaders can either surround themselves with people that will tell them what they want to hear, what they hope is true, or they can provide them with a different viewpoint. It may not even be an opposing viewpoint, but it may be different from what they're thinking. Now, according to the experts in political science, looking back, which of these two styles do you think proves to be most valuable in the long run? I think you've got that one figured out. Our job, if we are a leader, is not to surround ourselves with people that think just like us. Otherwise, we just need one. Yeah. But to provide a variety of viewpoints. You think by now I would have thought of everything there is to think about. But just about every day in my life, I think, I never thought of that. however many weeks ago it was, I don't even remember the subject now, pathetically. But it was something that should have been so obvious to somebody as long as I've been around. And I told Adam, I had never thought of what you said. I don't remember what it was. But when I come to it again, I will be reminded, aha. I love getting aha moments at any stage of my life, but especially now. Aha. Our elders need to have a variety of viewpoints. It should not matter about chemistry. We shouldn't have a bunch of yes men. We need a variety of perspectives. We don't need inbreeding. Inbreeding is one of the biggest dangers anybody can be put in. There are a lot of jokes sometimes about sections of the country or families that are inbred, and it does not always prove very well genetically. It doesn't with ideas either. Inbreeding can give us a false sense of what reality is. Those of you that are into government and politics know what I mean when I say inside the Beltway. In Washington, D.C., the Beltway is sort of like the inner part, as it were, of Washington, D.C. And basically, only people inside the Beltway talk to people that are inside the Beltway. Wonder how much they know about what a Kansas wheat farmer is dealing with, or a Montana rancher. If you don't ever listen to anybody besides your own little group, you're going to be deprived and you're going to be ignorant. And we don't need that out of our leaders. They don't need to be inbred. California is a wonderful state as an example of people that listen to themselves. It's a beautiful state to visit. But I'm thinking, okay, you've got power outages and everything else, and you're going to have people riding around in electric cars. Tell that Nebraska farmer on a cold winter day that his truck is supposed to be an electric truck. That might be fine for a warm suburban climate where you're only going to go 20 or 30 miles. But for the whole world, it won't work. But everybody I know thinks this is just fine. Maybe you need to widen your circle. Both you, Ron, as a member, and our leaders as leaders. Another observation in this realm, and some of you have been on the receiving end of this. I don't know if any of our current elders were or not, but some others in here have. When you become an elder, you are an elder with your feet on the ground running full speed. There are no junior elders. I'm not saying that you don't defer to the experience someone maybe in the eldership has had of dealing with a situation. Of course you should. But you don't go through this training process. And so, if you become an elder here sometime in the future and I still know how to write, you're very likely to get a note from me commending you, encouraging you, and reminding you that you are a full-fledged elder and you need to act like it. How dare you, Ron? You put yourself above elders? I put myself with the scriptures. Tell me that position is wrong. That's a good stopping place.